In this next screencast, we're going to have a look at the Stanford prison experiment, which is one of Zimbardo's most famous studies. We're also going to look at his idea that we conform to social roles. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of Zimbardo. This study he conducted when he was an undergraduate, and he obviously studied at Stanford. In the middle, you can see one of the adverts which was used to gather his volunteer sample. So you can read, it says, male students needed to participate in a psychological study of prison life. They were paid $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. $15 obviously doesn't sound like very much now, but you've got to remember that this was in the 1970s, and the study was meant to run for 2 weeks in total. On the right hand side, you can see like a movie poster. There have been a few replications of this study done for more kind of entertainment value. So the movie poster that you can see on the right hand side is one, and there was also one that was done for the BBC. So the Stanford prison experiment, the experiment was conducted in 1971, as I said, and it was led by Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo. 24 male college students were all from the US, all went to Stanford University, and they were paid $15 per day to participate. And the candidates were chosen because they were mentally and physically healthy. So an advert was put out, they volunteered themselves, and then the ones who were physically and emotionally healthy were chosen. That's really, really important, as you'll see a little bit later on in the study. They were also similar in terms of age, education, race and social class. And because of their similarities, at the start of the experiment, they all considered each other as equals. Now, this was set up because there were a number of reports of brutality by prison officers across different prisons in the late 1960s. And Zimbardo was testing the idea that, well, there's two options here. Either these prison officers had sadistic personalities, they enjoyed hurting people, they enjoyed putting people down, and that would be a personality factor in terms of their behaviour. The other option is that maybe the situation causes the officers to behave in that way. So that's a situational factor. Now, the method. So the mock prison was built. It was in the basement of the psychology department, as I said, at Stanford University. The sample was a volunteer sample, and as I said before, these were all men who were deemed emotionally stable. They underwent rigorous testing by psychologists, and they had no previous mental or emotional issues. And then they were randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner. The prisoners were arrested, so they did not know that this was going to happen, so they hadn't consented to this part of the study. But to make it more believable, make it more realistic, on a quiet Sunday morning in August, a police car swept through the town, picked up the 12 college students who would end up being the prisoners, and that was part of a mass arrest for armed robbery and burglary. Obviously they were false crimes, they hadn't really committed those crimes. The suspects were picked up at their home, they were charged, spread-eagled on the police car, searched, handcuffed and taken to the prison. So, method for the guards. They had their own uniform. You can see the picture on the left-hand side. Handcuffs, they had keys, they had mirror shades. Mirror shades important because you couldn't then see their face. And they were told that they had complete power over the prisoners. They were not given specific instructions, but they were told that they had complete power. So, for example, they decided that they would decide when the prisoners would go to the toilet. It wasn't something they were instructed to do. That's something that they decided amongst themselves. The prisoners, on the other hand, they had a number of strict rules to follow. The prisoners were referred to as numbers, as you can see on the shirt on the bottom right-hand side picture, so 5486. And they were also issued with a uniform. Results. So the guards, there was a quite slow start to the study. They didn't take on their roles very seriously in the first kind of day or two. However, later on in the study, getting towards day 1, day 2, and they started to take on these roles and took them quite seriously. So they harassed prisoners, they reminded them that they were constantly being monitored, and they would do things like frequent head counts. So they would wake them up in the middle of the night and ask the prisoners to line up, and they would have to shout out their numbers. Later in the study, they then started being a little bit more kind of embarrassing and demeaning punishments. So they got them to do things like cleaning the toilet. You can see that the prisoner in the picture at the top is doing push-ups. And they became gradually more brutal and more aggressive towards the prisoners. The prisoners, they rebelled after day 2. This was when they still weren't taking it overly seriously. So this was a kind of turning point in the study. The prisoners rebelled after day 2, and the guards had to squash this rebellion. So they fought back with things like fire extinguishers. The prisoners were shouting and swearing at the guards, and this was the point where really the guards started taking the study a lot more seriously. One prisoner was released on the first day, so they showed signs of psychological disturbance. Remember, these are normal prisoners or normal college students. They had no emotional or mental issues before this study started. 2 more were released on day 4, and they were on the verge of kind of psychological breakdown. And the study was ended after 6 days. It was meant to go on, as I said, for 2 weeks, but the conditions were deemed so unethical that the study was stopped very early. So, conclusion. The simulation revealed the power of the situation. It wasn't that the guards were evil, it wasn't that the guards were sadistic, it was the powerful situation that they were put in that made them react and behave in that way. Guards, prisoners, and actually the researchers as well all conformed to their roles within the prison. So the guards took on that guard role and started behaving more and more brutally. The prisoners took on their prisoner role and they became more and more submissive. And actually the researcher, Zimbardo himself, got very caught up in the study. He started acting as the kind of prison warden. And it's important to note that identification with the social role that was given, that was the key important kind of conclusion that Zimbardo drew from this. So the guards identified themselves as guards, prisoners identified themselves as prisoners. Now, this is a slightly separate study with some similarities to the original Zimbardo study. Reicher and Haslam, they conducted a similar study which was actually broadcast on the BBC. They had 5 guards and 10 prisoners, and they found that the guards didn't actually identify with their role very much. They didn't become brutal, they didn't become aggressive, whereas the prisoners did increasingly identify with their role as the study went on. And it actually ended with the prisoners, they overtook the guards, they took charge of the prison. So Reicher and Haslam concluded that people do not automatically assume roles that they are given. They don't automatically assume this role of the guard. What I would like to have a think about before the lesson is why are these findings so different? Why do you think this can be used to evaluate both Zimbardo's study and his theory that we conform to social roles? So before you come to the lesson, without looking at the PowerPoint or the pre-reading, please make sure that you can do the following. So number 1, explain what's meant by conformity to social roles. Number 2, explain Zimbardo's study in detail, including his aim, his method, results and conclusion. And thirdly, explain how Reicher and Haslam's study can be used to evaluate Zimbardo's explanation, so conformity to social roles.